All right, so should start seeing people trickling in. There's about 8 people, 10 people. Cool. Give people a few minutes to get into the webinar and then we'll get started. In the meantime, I'm going to pour myself a beer. Got myself a Church Congressional Pilsner with me, so excited
No, I
to
didn't think ahead. I don't know what I'm doing.
dig
It's
into
late here
this.
and everything. That was a mistake.
Oh, sorry, bud. I forgot to mention that this was my routine.
I'm used to doing these at 10 in the morning, so
Right on. All right, we're about 20 people in, and I've got to wait for my phone to settle out so I can get a nice frothy top on this beer. So I'll kind of get started just introducing ourselves and then, talking, getting into the meat of what we want to talk about. So, hey, everybody, I'm Stefan. I am the host of the webinar. I'm a technical sales manager at Brew Culture, and today we're going to talk about modern lagers.
all
With
right.
me is Erik Fowler. He is Education and Brewery Experience Manager at White Labs Pure Yeast and Fermentation. Erik, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for joining us and giving us a bit of your time. Why don't you just start off by telling us a bit about what is an education and brewery manager?
Well, first off, again, thanks for having me. And I wish we would have crossed paths a lot more or at all in person the last year. As we were saying before we jumped on here, we had some rad parties planned together, and hopefully this year changes things and we can be sharing beers. But my name is Erik Fowler. I'm the Education and Brewery Experience Manager here at White Labs. White Labs obviously being primarily a brewer's yeast company, but we do a lot more to support that and to spread the gospel of yeast and fermentation. So the education side of my role focuses on stuff like this: technical workshops, speaking at different events, creating technical collateral, working with you all to hopefully answer any of your partners' questions, or any of the breweries you're working with, and equipping you with the materials that uh, help you do what you do as well. The brewery experience side is a little bit different and something that's grown in our company a lot in the last couple of years. So here in San Diego, where I'm based, we have a 24 hectoliter 4 vessel brew house that's primarily used to make brewer's wort, right? We use that wort instead of making beer. We use it to propagate yeast. But we had the idea of being a company of a lot of brewers. Well, we have all the equipment. Why don't we make some beer with it too? And so we're
Yeah.
able to do a lot of split batching, right? And we have essentially 5 hectoliter tanks that we do half batches a lot, and then we'll say make a base wort of an IPA and then split it into two 5 hectoliter tanks side by side, pitch two different yeast strains. So some of the data that we're going to show and talk about today actually stems from our brewery. So it's kind of tying it all together, right? We're not just here saying, here's what we think you should do. We are able to actually perform and validate a lot of those tests and trials on a somewhat commercial scale, and have a tasting room and in San Diego and then Asheville, North Carolina as well. So
Nice.
kind of tying it all together and looking at the full process of making beer, and not just making yeast, but how should we handle the yeast? How does that affect beer? How do temperatures affect those resulting beers? And how can we better some of our catalog and data to talk about that?
Perfect. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. So, we're going to talk about that specifically surrounding modern lagers and the craft breweries. You're going to give us an overview of the factors that impact lager fermentation, time, flavor outcomes, and then we're going to dive into a few fermentation profiles. We're going to finish that conversation off that by building, by asking some questions around what you just talked about and diving just a tad deeper into some of the subjects that you covered, whether it be like flavor impact or specific techniques and yeast strains. For everybody on the webinar, if you want to ask a question, the chat is open and I'm monitoring that. The Q&A is also open and I'm monitoring that as well. Ask away. This is meant to be a conversation with y'all. So we'll try and answer as we go. If not, we'll catch it near the end. The goal is always to share our knowledge with as many brewers as possible, and to provide inspiration for current and future beers. And I think between myself and Erik, we should be able to give y'all a couple of ideas of what to do next, or things that you can implement in the brewery for some quick wins. So without further ado, I will pass this over to Erik, and he will tell us about fermenting lagers.
Cool. And you're able to see my screen, right? See
I
the
am
slide deck?
able. Yep.
All right. Uh, yeah, this is a topic that comes up a lot, and um, it's very relevant because consumers are looking at lagers as a growing market segment right now, right? I think people are kind of going back to roots of beer styles, and you see a lot more lighter lagers being brewed today than you did 5+ years ago, which is awesome. With that said, I was just talking to a local brewery here who's arguably the best lager producer in San Diego. And, we were talking about, it's like, man, this whole lineup of lagers you had, they had a Rauch beer, it was like a oak smoked Helles, a Vienna lager, a Pilsner, then a couple IPAs because it's San Diego and craft beer.
Of
And,
course.
it's like, you guys are really getting well known and for your lagers. It's like, yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that. 75% of the beer, guessing the number of what he said, but 75% of what goes out the door still are IPA. So, I think it's interesting to see sometimes how, while we talk about these different styles and different fermentation techniques a lot, it can be slow moving and not necessarily representative of the overall beer that's being sold, but it's a way of expanding our horizons and portfolios. So we'll talk about fermentation timeline overview, factors affecting fermentation performance, such as pitch rates, temperature, strain selection, and then, as you mentioned, a couple fermentation profiles as well, which just kind of lend some context. When we talk about yeast and fermentation, we say it depends a lot. People are looking for hard and fast rules on this is how it's done, right? We're craft brewers. We're not German brewers. And I would assume probably most of us on this call, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same thing I'm saying. I'm always saying it depends on your equipment. You'll have to figure out what works in your brewery. And this is what we know today. Tomorrow we might know something completely new and 180 on what we're thinking or saying.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So let's take a broad approach, and let's talk about what the yeast we're actually talking about. So lagering, being a process, being a style, but also being indicative of the yeast that's used to make it. It's kind of all of those things at once. When people say, what's the difference between ales and lagers? I think it's kind of a weighted question. Anytime I'm doing different, beer consumer public facing classes, I like asking that question because it's a lot of different answers and they're all right. So let's talk about the yeast that's used. So Saccharomyces pastorianus, or Carlsberg Genesis, if you look at some of the older brewing texts, tends to be a bottom fermenter, right? That's one distinction between ales and lagers. Lagers tend to be bottom fermenters, but when you look at the geometry of a lot of the conical fermenters that we're using today, like, what do? They push the yeast to the bottom. They're designed to collect that yeast and push it to the bottom. So depending on the volume and geometry of your fermenter, it's likely that most strains you're using are fermenting towards the bottom. Colder fermentation temperatures, limited strain variety. So genetically, there's a lot less to work with, and we see that in flavor production as well, right? If you look at the broad spectrum of ale strains, there's these big, massive flavor producers, which are your Belgian strains. There's some of your more wild characteristic strains, and then there's these slightly cleaner strains, which are more of your American style strains. But lagers kind of have they fit within a much tighter band than the ale strains. And then the genetics, where it came from. So Saccharomyces pastorianus is a hybrid of Cerevisiae and Eubionis, which is interesting. And we've done a lot of full genome sequencing over the last five-ish years, and we're starting to learn more to to piggyback on what you said, right? You can see where they all stand genetically, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to behave in a similar way or produce similar flavor. And it's likely that that's the case, but we haven't really dove into why or what the similarities between these strains are.
It's crazy, right? That we know so much, but we know so little. Like I'm always surprised at that. It's like, oh yeah, we have 100 ways to brew lagers, and then it's like, yeah, but we don't quite know just yet why it's doing this.
Yeah, and we also, we tend to get bogged down quite a bit on wanting to know more, but if it doesn't actually apply in practice, doesn't matter, right? And
Yeah.
I'm probably um, of a different background and opinion than a lot of people, that work at White Labs that come from traditional science backgrounds where, it's like, I have to know why. And I'm like, no, the brewer has to know that it works. The brewer has to know that it's consistent. The consumer has to know that the brewer can utilize it to make a good beer over and over again. What's actually happening when this amino acid, is utilized compared to this other one. It does matter, but we have to look at the practicality of it and the totality of everything that a brewer is doing day to day, right?
Oh
Is
yeah.
that knowledge gonna help them make a better beer? Maybe, but let's take a step back and see what actually matters. Let's talk about how these temperatures can change the fermentation profile and how to manipulate them, and how to make the best tasting beer consistently, and what's actually happening with that yeast strain during that time. Let's not worry about that right now. Let's look at the resulting product and work backwards.
Yeah, and I think I can second that kind of sentiment. I worked in the biggest breweries in Canada, and at the end of the day, we had access to all the lab equipment that you'd ever possibly want. But the biggest changes we ever made were from our sensory panel. So if it didn't, it could be analytically perfect, but everything had to go through the sensory panel. And the biggest changes we made to our process were typically coming from off flavors or, not to profile that we were actually seeing there. So I always push people towards taste the beer, get a group of people, make it consistent, make it structured, and that way you can actually improve and track what you're doing and what you're not doing right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with lagers, there's a lot less to hide behind, right? There's a lot less yeast expression and other ingredients, and anything maybe that went wrong in your fermentation profile is going to show up. But it's not very forgiving. You're not going to notice a clean lager fermentation if it goes right. You're only going to notice it if it goes wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, and taste knowing what it tastes like on the day that you start your cooling is something that's important. Like that's something I learned a long time ago. It's like you got to know how this is going to taste when it's carbonated, so that you can adapt your aging process or something like that if you can. Sometimes you just can't.
Mm-hmm. So when selecting a yeast strain, this applies to working with any type of yeast for any beer style, but set the parameters, know what you're know what you're intending to brew before you decide to brew it. Um, it can happen where you are working with the raw ingredient that you're really excited about and want to tailor a recipe to that, or maybe it's a house strain that you're required to tailor something to. But ideally, if you're working with a new ingredient, um, come up with what the beer your target profile is first, and then find a suitable strain to get you there, as opposed to the other way around. So decide on flavor concept. It doesn't seem like a yeast strain would impact the malt character of a beer, but it 100% does. And um, some strains can accentuate different characters um, a little bit better than others. And we've seen that, through 25 years of experience. And we've also seen it in our brewery here, where we'll have two lager strains side by side and see maybe how they play well or don't play well with adjuncts or different malt or hop character. Pitch rates are obviously really important for all beer styles, but especially lagers, again, being a little bit more unforgiving, and the timeline is a little more stretched due to those low temperatures. You need a little bit more yeast to get you there. So I mean, one thing that we like talking about is the general 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato, right? And that's a great jumping off point for pitch rates. But, and we're talking generally ale here at this point, but a lot of that's been stemmed from sequential generations, right? So like a lot of lab grown yeast tends to be in a better physiological state and not require as much yeast. With that said, there could be benefits to pitching more yeast, and especially in lagers, and that's why you'll see, and we'll talk about some of the different techniques to get you there in the upcoming slides, but you'll see some of those suggested pitch rates rise when it comes to lager fermentation. And a big reason for that is flavor and speed. So more yeast generally equates to less flavor due to less growth, or a faster fermentation too, due to not having that lag phase and starting with more biomass at the onset of fermentation. Temperature and pitch rates. So yeah, one of the profiles we'll talk about is pitching more at ale temperatures, and then after 24 hours, and before you start getting a lot of that flavor production, lowering the temperature to your desired fermentation temperature. So allowing that initial pitch to have more growth and kind of speed up while lowering it. This is kind of more the craft brewer's approach. The benefits of that are, cost savings. You don't have to pitch as much yeast right away. The risks would be that if you let it go too long, you could see flavor impact from that. If you're going to pitch cold, essentially for a lager, just double the suggested pitch rate's a good rule of thumb. And we'll kind of get into more detail.
I'll jump in there. Like I think that's what, as a sales rep who talks to a lot of brewers, like that's typically the recommended, default pitch rate that we're kind of sharing with Canadian breweries. So if you know what you're going to be doing, brewers, like let us know. We're going to be in a much better position to tell you exactly what kind of pitch rate you need. Because if you're going to be doing these warmer ferments, or these pressurized fermentations, we'll be able to better tailor your order and get the right thing to you. So the more info, the better.
Totally. And that was like a caveat from experience, I could tell.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. How much did you pitch? And it's like, well, I always use 2 liters for this. It's like, yeah, but it's a different beer.
Yeah.
Same reason you changed how much water you added and how much malt you're using. And it's a different recipe, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeast is alive and you got to treat it like anything else that's alive.
Yeah. Yeah, and it works until it doesn't. So, looking at quantity again, I'm just kind of visualize, what I said on the last slide. But higher yeast counts are going to be, and this is across the board again, but we see it a lot more in lager fermentations because ales can be a little more forgiving. But quicker fermentation speed, lower metabolites, so again, lower flavor impact with more yeast. Which is why also even for ale pitching rates within craft beer, we've seen over time just brewers request more and more yeast because they want a cleaner beer. When you're spending a lot of money on hops, it makes sense that you want little yeast impact aside from how it might interact with some of the other ingredients. And decreased new cell growth, again, meaning less flavor. If it's too high, if you have too much cell growth, that's on the wrong line. But if you pitch too much yeast, not if you have too much cell growth, you can see issues with sequential generations, meaning you don't actually have enough new cell growth. So what you're pitching is an older population over and over again. So that's a question that I often get is there a negative to over pitching? And not necessarily, but when you do start to see sequential generations, if you're pitching too much and you're not getting a lot of new growth, you're going to have an older population going from batch to batch to batch, and it's going to kind of tire out a little bit quicker. So finding that balance of how much growth you want to have and how much new yeast from generation to generation.
Here's the visual that someone gave me. Like when you're over pitching like that, it's like you're relying on the same marathon runners. So it's like, generation one, that marathon runner is 30 years old. Generation two, that marathon runner is 40 years old. By generation six or seven, that marathon runner might be 80 years old. If you're not getting that cell growth, you're not rejuvenating like your 30-year-old marathon runner. Not to say that you can't have an amazing 80-year-old marathon runner. I don't want to discriminate here, but it kind of paints the picture when you're like going by power with numbers that sometimes you might not actually make it, especially if your process is to, collect and repitch. If you're just pitching fresh every time, which makes me and Erik super happy, then yeah, by all means, excess pitch.
Right. Yeah, and you could see some benefits from that too, right? Such as a quicker speed and lower flavor impact if you're working with a lager. So that makes sense. If you pitch on the lower end, you're going to see more flavor and a slower fermentation. So, again, these are rules of thumb. Lower and higher is very relative, depending on temperature, process, and strain. So keep in mind on your capabilities as well.
Yeah, there's so many other factors that are there, but this is starting point, and then you can kind of build from there.
Yeah. And then fermenting under pressure, which I think we get to in the next slide, but it may allow for warmer fermentation temperatures with reduced metabolite production, which I've got actually is coming up in a few. So we'll get to that. But just for some context on how temperature can play a role in fermenting a beer out is this ale versus lager, right? So it's the same wort. They were fermented at the temperature ranges suggested, for these strains. So the San Diego Super Yeast fermented out pretty quick, right? Hit terminal or relatively terminal gravity fairly quick and was fairly stable up until a little further down. But the Copenhagen lager yeast was a little more gradual, right? That gravity drop happens a little bit slower, which is why lagers take a lot longer and why we get asked about it so much is tips and tricks to try to speed up that production. And there's, multiple trains of thoughts on how to produce the best lager, but I've seen so many good commercial lagers produced with so many different methods that if somebody didn't explain how they brewed it and how they fermented it to the person drinking it, they would have no idea. And that's what we're trying to achieve, right? It doesn't really matter how we get there as long as it fits our process and our capabilities. So utilizing pressure, going up to 1 bar, about 15 psi, you're able to utilize higher temperatures. This is generally done with a lager strain. So in ale temperature ranges, so what is this, like 17, 18, 19 C?
Yeah, it's around that range. I think 68 lands on 20 or 18.
Yeah.
So
and so that'll speed up sorry, everything else is in Celsius and metric, I think, but they'll speed up fermentation and conditioning time, but also lowering that yeast growth and in return lowering flavor production.
So I was actually surprised by that. Like I always thought pressure was more about controlling flavor active metabolites. And this is the first time, like when I was reading through this earlier, I was like, oh, it can actually increase your speed. That's really interesting. Like I never considered trying to make lagers faster. I just kind of went with it. It's like, oh, they're slow,
Yeah, so I think exactly what you said is still right? So it's not the pressure. The pressure is controlling metabolite production. It's the temperature that's controlling speed. So being able to manipulate that flavor production and keep that minimal allows you to raise the temperature. And that faster temperature, Kvike's been the big one in the last couple of years. And everybody thinks like, oh, these strains ferment so quick. Well, you could take 001 and ferment it, at 30, 35 and just still produce like a super quick beer. It's just not going to taste good. So finding a strain that can ferment really hot and still produce something that we want to drink, that's the uniqueness of it. It's not necessarily indicative of the yeast strain itself. It's the temperature that's causing that fast fermentation. And so we see that here too, right? It's not, and I'll explain this in the next slide when we look at some of the ester compounds and the different levels from this trial. But what we see here is sorry, I got my video over it. So the high pressure lager at a cool temperature didn't perform well, right? That pressure plus those cold temperatures stressed the yeast out. I don't know if you can see my cursor as well, but
yeah.
You know, it was pretty slow. Like even looking at 40 days, it was just above terminal where these other beers hit. But at regular, 12C without pressure, it fermented out in, let's just say 2 weeks, a little bit under. What we see though is the warm beer, so 25C without pressure fermented super quick, right? So if you're just looking at the kinetics of this graph, I want to ferment all my lagers at 25 because this finished so fast.
So
but it's not taking
purple X's.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but it's not taking into account taste, right? So, yeah. I mean, it looks great on a graph. Like this beer finished like in 2 days, maybe. Like that's what I want to do, but it doesn't reflect how the beer tastes. But then we look at 25C under pressure, and the beer really dried out too, due to those warm temperatures. And the 25C with under pressure got down to like 3.5 Plato fairly quick, right?
And that's the green diamonds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so we're looking at that balance of temperature, pressure, and then what we're actually looking at taste-wise.
Yeah, the flavor at the end of the day. Yeah, so no one cut out just that graph and be like 25 degrees lagers.
You could, and you can call it what you want, but as you can see here, it might not taste great. So let's look at those same trials here. So we've got our 12C not under pressure. We had a pretty high level of some different esters here, right? You've got your amyl acetate, ethyl hexanoate, and then octanoate. We're all pretty high. I mean, they look like they're probably below threshold still. But we saw when we moved over to the pressure at a cool temperature, a ton of acetaldehyde. So the yeast was still very stressed there with very low metabolite production, which, maybe there's something to be said for that, but that's quite a bit of acetaldehyde. So I'd be concerned on that.
Yeah, 30 is definitely something that you're going to pick up. Even if you don't know that flavor, you're going to perceive something different.
Yeah, I think threshold's like 5 to 10 maybe ppm. So that's pretty high.
Yeah.
But also, this is where I think looking at some of the analytical results and compared to how something tastes, I think 30 is extreme, but the 25C at high pressure looked like it came out at 20. I mean, if that's in a Doppelbock, you might not taste it, right? Although acetaldehyde comes through a little bit more than some other compounds, to me personally. But look,
it depends where to this beer is going, right? Like to the consumer, acetaldehyde is not offensive per se. Like that's the other thing. It's like it's not going to win a beer award, but it, compared to other flavors that can show up as off flavors, acetaldehyde, green apple at those levels, and is not the most unappealing flavor to some drinkers, and they don't know. A lot of people don't know that that's what they're actually tasting.
Totally. And then looking at 25C, we had still a decent amount of flavor forward compounds, but then under pressure again we saw an increase in acetaldehyde, but we saw diminished ester production. So adding pressure at that warmer temperature definitely kind of stifles the ester production of strains, which you can balance that quicker fermentation speed. So you really have to put both those graphs together, right? You want that quicker fermentation speed, but you want low flavor
Yeah,
for a
you want to
lager.
find that balance of what you're willing to accept in terms of those different metabolites.
Yeah. So a couple examples, that might be useful and are just different trains of thoughts, right? Just trying to find what process might work best for your brewery. And they all have different considerations, right? This example one, again, kind of being the craft brew method, starting warmer, so 15 to 18 more ale temperatures, the lower end of ale temperatures. And then once you start seeing signs of fermentation, CO2 production, pH decrease, lower the temperature to your ideal fermentation range. So you're going to get more growth during that lag phase and build up more biomass to help that fermentation. So you're starting with less yeast, which is beneficial because it can be expensive, but you just have to really hone that process in so that you don't get a lot of flavor production start to happen and have the beer completely finish out before you even are able to control it. One thing that we like to look at internally here is when our glycol starts to kick on. We know that there's a lot of heat being produced, so that's one way that we can kind of monitor our lag phase and know that we can manipulate temperature based off of that.
That's actually a good trigger because I'm looking at that and I know how a lot of these breweries are set up. It's like they've got one dial and they don't have a program on it. So it's really, reliant on a human being there at the right time and place.
Totally.
And I know a lot of, I get anxiety about, oh, do I really want to decrease the temperature right now?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of nice to see this on paper that it's like, yes, this is a profile that can be done. It takes a bit of that anxiety of being like, oh, okay, I'm going to bring it back down in temperature now at a certain stage. Just as long as you have a reproducible way of doing this, like if one week you brewed it on Friday and you're not there Saturday, Sunday, like this is not replicatable.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. Um, yeah, and then obviously doing a diacetyl rest, and then slowly stepping down until you hit your lagering temp.
So can you touch on that slowly decreasing your temperature as opposed to crash cooling? Like,
Yeah, there's different trains of thought on that. I haven't seen anything concrete one way or another, whether you should just completely drop it. The school of thought is that you're going to precipitate solids a little bit better and allow that, somehow aids in conditioning. Um, I think it depends on the brewery. I'm a believer in, you're creating a lager to take time, and you've already have some processes here to speed things up. But it just really depends, and again, it's going to depend on the tank too, because if it's a super large tank, that's maybe as quick as you could do it anyway. So
yeah, the first thing that I went to when you said like precipitating solids was just tank geometry. I was like, yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so that's a great way that someone who's trying to not filter beer, for example, that's one tip that they could try and do is just look at crash cooling it, not crash cooling it, but cooling it like a couple of degrees per day until they hit that lager temperature.
mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yeah, that'd be a great suggestion if that was the intent. Yeah. When you're not really looking at yeast health at that point, right? Because you're gonna crash it and pull the yeast off as soon as you can, anyways. So that's not as much of a concern. And then more of a traditional, just starting low and slow, right? Just pitching at your fermentation temperature. Essentially, the next steps are all kind of the same. But diacetyl rest, when you're working with those low temperatures, everything's happening a lot slower. So that reduction of diacetyl and precursor happens a lot slower. So raising that temperature is going to speed that process up. That's why fermenting really warm, you're likely not to have as much of a diacetyl issue because everything's happening quick. The yeast is really active. But when you're working with a low temperature, the yeast is just moving a lot slower, and that uptake is going to happen a lot slower. There's a good chance that it could complete fermentation before it finishes uptaking that diacetyl and precursor, right? So ramping it up a couple points from terminal helps aid in that reduction.
So this is, here's a question that I have on diacetyl. So at the end of that free rise, be it like 10, 12 days, um, from the taste perspective and from the analytical perspective, like that diacetyl is still going to be flavor, like it's still going to be above threshold. Is that correct?
You mean
Like you're going to be able to taste that. It's going to be like upwards of 30 ppb
like
ppms
prior to the diacetyl rest or post
at
diacetyl?
post acetyl rest. Or would you expect that to like drop it down below threshold?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't crash until you're below threshold on it, right? If you're crashing, there's not much you can do, right? And especially if the beer is just about at terminal, that yeast is going to essentially go dormant, and it's not getting that tank temperature back up is going to be pretty much impossible because you don't really have a lot of heat being generated. So, that's a pretty common issue with a fermentation issue with any type of beer is somebody crashing too early, because like once you've done that, you're kind of screwed. So ensuring, doing a forced diacetyl test before you crash it, and using that as one of those key indicators to say this tank is ready to be crashed and conditioned, because
Okay,
there's
so
no more manipulating that beer after you're crashing it.
that's actually a good metrics then. So no, like again, going back to tasting your beer at the end of fermenting and knowing what that should taste like versus and being able to identify that diacetyl at that level. Because I I've known from experience it is not perceived in the same way because there's a lot of other things. Your beer is still very green,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not going to come out as clean and as direct. Once your beer is green, that's all that's left, diacetyl.
Yeah.
But at that stage of the game, there's a lot of other things kind of competing for flavors. So being really good at identifying that your diacetyl isn't completely cleaned up is something that is really hard to get from a sensory perspective.
Yeah, and when we're talking about like forced diacetyl tests, like some points to look at on that are, what you're doing is you're forcing the conversion of that precursor, right? So that alpha acetylactate's the precursor to diacetyl, and that's flavorless and odorless. And so you could smell your beer straight out of the tank and it could be fine. If you smell diacetyl there, it means there's a lot of diacetyl, but there's probably the potential, the total diacetyl is a lot higher, right? Total diacetyl being how much diacetyl there plus your precursor. Through oxidation, that precursor converts to diacetyl, and that's what we taste and don't like or smell. And so using a forced diacetyl test, heating that sample forces that conversion to give you a good sensory analysis of that total diacetyl, that potential, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
And so looking at, again, lab results is a great metric, but it's super easy to do without it. Just you don't want to be looking at any other you don't want to be looking at acetaldehyde or any other compounds in that test, because if there's any yeast in there, heating it up is going to express some other nasty flavors. So trying to spin that sample down or decant it from yeast is preferable, but you're only looking for diacetyl in that test and using that
Yeah.
as a metric to, throw it on your cellar log that it passed it this day for panel or a couple people, right? I
Yeah.
always suggest having a couple people clear anything.
Definitely more than one person. Um, okay, so just because there's a bit of confusion in the chat about where to start this diacetyl rest, can you go back to example 2? So I'll re-explain this and you tell me if I understood this right.
Okay.
The way you've got traditional pitch method in example 2 is that you're starting your fermentation at the ideal fermentation temperature for the lager strain, and the only temperature control on that fermenter is 18 degrees Celsius. Correct?
So you're raising the temperature, you mean, right? So
Yeah.
your set point's going to be, let's say 12. And then once you hit, let's say the last 10% of fermentation. So
Okay, so you do have a Plato, like a terminal plus X
yeah, I
mark
would
that
say
you want to hit.
2 points above gravity is
Okay,
would be a good rule of
perfect.
thumb, because you want fermentation to be active enough to be able to raise the temperature, right? If you're at terminal, again, it's not producing a lot of heat, so raising that tank is going to be hard. Like, you can push your
Yes.
set point really high, but you're not
It's
going to
just
get
not
there.
going
And
to move.
so, right, so having a little bit of metabolism still active is going to create heat, and you'll be able to raise your tank there. And once you get it up there, it's a little bit easier to manipulate and keep, right?
Perfect. Yeah, that was the question. Like someone's asking like what stage above terminal would you go? And you hit the mark there. Perfect.
Cool. Yeah, say 2 points or 10%, so you can figure out what that equates to. 2 points, just a good rule of thumb.
Perfect.
Pressurized fermentation. So you start warm. You utilize a spooning valve that you set to 15 psi. I would probably wait 24 hours and then set that pressure. You could also leave a little bit more headspace, because the drawback is that you have the potential of trapping sulfur, right? And so if the sulfur is not able to blow off, if you've set the pressure high and allow that to build, it's going to just dilute back into the beer. And then there are ways to scrub that, but not every beer you really want to do that for. So allowing that first day um, to just be a little more active, and then setting the spooning valve at 1 bar. And then just kind of the same thing, then just crashing. No diacetyl rest is necessary because you're already at that warmer temperature, right? So again, things being quicker, that conversion happens a lot quicker.
And then now that you have that spunding valve on, are you going to end up with a higher level of carbonation in this beer at the end of fermentation than you would otherwise in like by just having it free to the atmosphere?
That's a good question. You could utilize it for that. I mean, traditionally, right? That's what it's being used for. So, there is a way of doing that, but you still want to allow most of that CO2 to blow off once it's hit that pressure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I'd
Yeah.
imagine it would have an impact on just your whole yeast, like
Yeah, and that's a good point
everything.
too. Yeah, you really would want to, the warmer temperature for those lager strains and that pressure, you would really want to keep a better eye on your yeast handling, and not assume that you can go as many generations. But you know, um, tank turn time is can be a lot more valuable sometimes than a couple $100 for yeast. So it's all a balance, right? If you have more tanks than you know what to do with, brew it the traditional way and let it sit for 2 months. Like, that's great. But if you're, in a pub setting or a production brewery that's at capacity, develop a process that can turn the beers a little bit quicker. But just know that it is going to vary on yeast strain. We've got our WP 925 high pressure lager yeast that is promoted as being able to use this process, but a lot of strains. I think it was 866 Helles or 860 Helles or 833 Bach in the previous example that was used. So you can use other lager strains for this, but it's going to take experimentation. Those are good starting points.
Nice. Yeah, someone literally suggested WLP not 925 as you were talking about it.
Cool.
What's the name of that one just for those who aren't number
Yeah, high pressure lager
orientated?
yeast.
Okay,
Yeah, that's why it's
perfect.
a little, talking about it in this context, it doesn't
Nice.
sound like the name, but it is.
And
Um,
and like what is that highest pressure? Like what does that mean? Is that the 1 bar that we're talking about on the spunding, or is that beyond?
that's my experience. What I've seen, looking at the trial that Chris was part of, looked like they did up to 2 bars. That seems like a lot of pressure to me. You would want to make sure the rating on your tank is suitable for it too. But I think that's a good starting point. And if you can ferment something quick at that and only be working with 15 psi instead of 30, that would be my suggestion. But I haven't seen trials going higher, so I don't know what the limit on it is, to be honest.
I mean, most breweries I don't even think would have tanks that could handle 2 bar. Like most of the ones I've worked with in the 20 hectoliter systems have a pressure release at 20
Hmm.
because the tank is rated at 30.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I imagine the yeast wouldn't be too happy at that, but
No.
I don't know. Somebody prove me wrong. That'd be great.
There we
Uh,
go. Challenge is out.
so to summarize, before we kind of get into some of the other Q&A and some of the questions that we were talking about beforehand, but there are multiple fermentation profiles for lagers, and it's kind of nice to have those tools. Our brewery is able to work with so many different yeast strains. We work with a lot of different fermentation profiles. We kind of have, our set standard profiles for strains maybe we haven't used as much, but we can vary quite a bit depending on what we're. I mean, it's the same thing for any other ingredient. Like you sub out other ingredients, your process is going to change. So, but they're all going to result in different flavor production, fermentation speed, which is probably the most applicable to the context of this conversation. Is like, how do we not risk the integrity of the flavor of our products, but increase speed? And talking about craft beer, I think it's always important to start with flavor, right? We don't do
Yeah.
this because we want to produce a lot of beer very fast or make a lot of money doing it. But we do it because we want a flavorful product that the market usually doesn't see, right? And so it's always important, again, working backwards. Like, let's talk flavor first. Let's not lose sight of the beer. If we're looking to cut corners with speed, and we don't care about flavor as much, our product integrity, like there's plenty of ways to do that. And maybe yeast isn't even the way to do it. There's plenty of processes to do that. But
Yeah.
let's talk flavor first, and what processes can we do to achieve that flavor while satisfying the business side of the company.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. Like, I'll build on that a bit. Like, you're starting from that flavor, and that's always how I designed recipes as well. It's like, here's my flavor. How am I going to get there? But the other kind of consideration is what can your brewery handle? Like, I did 60 days lagering because I could in one of my breweries. It was kind of like a haha, joke's on you. I can do it for 60 days. Kind of, but was it necessary? Probably not, but I could handle it. And I actually had to figure out a way to, that beer got popular enough that I actually had to scale it up to like 10 times the size of it. And as we went through that scale up, we definitely had to find ways, call it cutting corners, or, optimize it, make it, commercially viable, to be able to supply it in that demand. So start with what your capacity is. And then when you really need to build it out, or your business demands that it's quicker, and you can't put more tanks because you built your brewery in somewhere too small like everybody else, then you can start looking at the ways to make it go quicker and flip the tank faster. Like, I think that's one of the, to quote Shakespeare, like, learn the English grammar rule first and then you can break them all. And I think brewing is very similar to that. It's like, if you can learn how to do it like in a slower method in the winter months, great time to experiment with lagers. Then when you hit summer, you can probably play with it a bit and tweak it and spin it out of the tank a bit faster using some of these methods that we talked about.
Right on. Yeah, you're that kind of drunk. I'll start quoting Shakespeare.
Oh yeah.
We had a question come through that I wanted to touch on. We got a couple more minutes here, and totally unrelated to lagering per se, but a question we get a lot. And I think we can probably set up another time to do another webcast together, and just even, it'd be fun to do one where it's just oddball questions the whole time, and we just try to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and answer it. But what are the thoughts on topping up, essentially double batching, and say 20 barrel, do 2 turns of 20 barrels into a 40 barrel tank? How should you pitch that? That's an awesome question. And again, it varies quite a bit. What we've seen the most success with is it's all based on timing, right? That's the biggest key, is like, can you do those 2 turns and within 12 hours? Because that's going to probably change what I suggest right now. But I would suggest pitching the whole initial volume. So, 40 barrels worth of yeast initially during that first knockout, and then transferring on top of that. If you in aerating during both, if you're taking more than 24 hours, I would say aerate on the initial knockout and not on the second. And you could, in theory, then pitch the 20 barrels worth of yeast for 20 barrels worth of wort, and then 24 hours later rack another 20 barrels on top of that. So those are the two most successful methods that we've seen. But it will change, like there will be flavor impact to that, taking that 24 hours and only pitching 20 barrels worth and then racking on top of that. So make sure that you're consistent with that process, because if you have to do that sometimes and you don't have to do that other times, the beer is probably going to change a little bit.
And at the 49th minute of our conversation, you threw in aeration, another factor to take into consideration when brewing, that we haven't talked about so far. So that's, like that's just a level of details that, you can look at, and, one variable at a time to get it right, for me, is the, direction to do it.
Yeah.
If you change everything at the same time, you're never gonna know what worked and what didn't work. So yeah, just
I thought that as I was saying it too. It's like, but you know what? Like doing these in an hour is hard. Like we teach 3-day,
oh yeah,
full lectured and hands-on workshops on going through all of this, but just kind of breaking it up, I think, makes it a little more digestible. Just talking about temperature, and then pressure and the temperature in relation to that today, I think lends a lot of visibility and context, right? It makes it very understandable.
yep.
But yeah, I mean, there's a ton of variables too. Like we barely touched on pitch rate, and then oxygen, like not so much at all. So how those affect all that too. I mean, it all changes it. It's all matrix.
Yeah, I
So
think I think there's a whole webinar on just wort production for lager here, where it's like you got a couple of expert brewers, and how they produce that wort, and then you who's there with the, okay, how do you treat that wort to best make it ready for your fermentation, because there's a whole conversation about nutrients there as well, and fan, and
yeah,
and all
yeah,
that other fun stuff,
yeah.
just to throw a whole bunch of ideas and, wait, what's fan, into the conversation. Does If anybody has more questions, like now's a great time to ask them. I'm gonna ask one just quickly, because we didn't really touch on this subject yet, but like there are also a few yeast strains that are, what we're calling pseudo lagers, and I think you touched on Kvike a bit. What do we have in the White Labs catalog that can help reduce that time crunch issue, specifically for craft brewers who are looking for, a summer quick turnaround crusher?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the characteristic of lagers being clean beers, and again by clean we mean low yeast expression, so they're not putting a lot of flavor out. How do we find yeast strains that work at those warmer temperatures that are clean? We say a lot of the Kvike strains, specifically 518 Opshog Kvike ale yeast, is fairly clean. I I see people using it for beers that they call lager, but I think even so that strain's usually used on like the high end of the temperature spectrum, but fermenting it more at regular ale temperatures takes a little bit longer, but does produce a cleaner beer. It still has a distinctive ester characteristic to me, to where I would personally suggest somebody uses more of a Kolsch ale yeast, or um, something that's on the little lower end, might be fermented at 16, 17, and produce a cleaner beer, just because the nature of that strain is okay at that temperature and they're fairly clean. One I like a lot is 1983 is our catalog number. Charlie's Fist Bump Ale Yeast. It's
Oh
Charlie
yeah.
Papazian's strain. Yeah, and it doesn't get a whole lot of love, but he's written books where he's brewed every style under the sun using that one yeast strain.
I learned how to
And
brew with his 2 books, man. Best
yeah,
books ever.
right. And it's cool being able to work with them and bank that strain and provide that for everybody. But it doesn't get as much love. I mean, I see homebrewers really enjoy it because that's he's such a legend in that realm, but he's done so much for the professional side too. And that yeast strain is very applicable. So you can brew ales and lagers, and I mean pretty low temperatures. Like I think it says like 13 to 23 is what you can ferment that strain at and produce a clean beer. So I
Wow.
think that's a good starting point. Being able to work with such a wide temperature range, you can really dial in that process and balance of speed versus a clean fermentation profile.
I like it. Yeah, that's actually pulling one out of like, that is not common of what we know could do a really good job. I like that. There's one question here from Chris. When is the best time / temp to harvest during that slow temp decrease?
To harvest during, it's going to be a balance of being able to pull the yeast off as soon as possible um, with being able to still collect enough, right? So in order to concentrate that slurry, the longer it's in there and the colder it is, the more concentrated yeast pack you're going to get. But you're also risking that beer sitting on that yeast cake longer than it needs to, and risking cell death or stressing the yeast out. So I'm going to say again, it depends. Like you're really going to have to pull samples and look at the health of that yeast.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna
Um,
say. Get the microscope out. Like it's not that big
yeah,
of an investment. It's relatively easy to learn, but it's worth $1 million in terms of data.
totally. If you can get, one extra harvest and pitch from pulling a slurry, you're saving a couple $100, and that pays for a $300-400 microscope once.
Easily.
Yeah,
Yep.
in a little bit of
Easily.
time. Yeah, if you're not using a microscope, yeah, I would make a strong argument to figure out how to get one in house and start using it.
Right on. All right. So Erik is on a tight timeline. We got 2 minutes left now. I always like to ask this question at the end before we go. Erik, what do you want to brew lager wise? Like, what are you super excited about? Whether it's you or that brewery you mentioned at the beginning of the
Mm-hmm.
webinar. Like, what are you getting stoked on?
I like smoked beers a lot, but I've been burned from not being able to sell them too many times. So so it always tends to be the brewer's tap, right? But I tend to always like just crisp, like German lagers, something that's pretty quaffable. Like this, I shouldn't say the saddest thing I heard this year, because there's been a lot of sad things this year. But in the beer world, one of the saddest things I've heard is Sierra Nevada nixing Summerfest, and that was always my summer beer. And we go out to the Colorado River here and out in Arizona each year a couple times, and it's like the perfect river beer, and it just brings me back. So it's a bummer to see that's gone. So creating a clone of that, something similar to that, would
Right
be in the
on.
wheelhouse, I think. Kind of hop forward in a Pilsner way, where there's it's traditional, but there's a little grassiness or a little lemon zest, but it's still subtle and firm bitterness.
All right. Wow. We didn't pre-talk about this. I kind of popped this one on Erik, and my mind is same place, but from a different approach. Like I've been really enjoying like true to style Dortmunders. Like I just think they're just like the export Helles style. I just think it's that beautiful combination of bitterness and not quite the Pilsner and just the right of like the perfect amount of lager. That's where my head goes right now. So it sounds like
Right on.
Summerfest is somewhere along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, we've got a Helles that we do here that's in tank right now, and I can't wait for it to come out. Temperature's starting to heat up. So I see we got another Todd Fowler here. All right. A couple
All right.
Fowlers.
Right on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It's great. And I was, let's definitely do this again and figure out ways to keep the conversation going.
Perfect. And I see Garrett's got like a question. We'll flip that in emails. It's very specific to 927. We are out of time. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you have more questions, just flip them to me and we'll get them to the right people or get you the right answers. You can find this webinar on YouTube in a couple of days once we edit out all the uhs and ahs. And thanks for listening. And I hope everybody learned something. Thank you, Erik, for joining us. That was awesome. You learn something every day. It's true. And, I just love sitting here talking about beer with everyone.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you. And I will finish off by saying, everybody, lager long and prosper. We are out.
Dig it. Cheers.
Cheers.